Well, joining us today is Ray Hershel. He's spent 50 years, the past 50 years at Western Mass News. Congratulations on a successful career.
Mike, thank you very much. Appreciate your time today, and it's been a great 50 years, I've got to tell you. And as strange as it may sound, those 50 years have gone by very, very fast. I can remember starting back in 1968 on the radio at WHYN then. But it's been a great career. I worked with some outstanding people, had a chance to do some traveling, cover different stories, different places, and I have no regrets about those 50 years. As I said before, it's really gone by quickly.
For people who don't know, tell us a little bit about where you grew up and how you got interested in journalism.
I'm a local guy from Western Mass. I grew up in Chicopee, Mass. My parents were from this area, obviously, and went to local schools, went to elementary school in Chicopee at the Sheridan Street School until 4th grade, then went to St. Stanislaus Elementary School through 8th grade, graduated from Holyoke High School, and then went on to Emerson College in Boston, where I got a degree in broadcast journalism and in English. So I'm a local guy. I have family ties. My wife is from Springfield, so she's from Western Massachusetts as well. So we've settled in this area, made my professional career in this area, and raised our children in this area. They're all grown up now, but we stayed in Western Massachusetts. The only time I really went away for any significant period of time was for college. 4 years in Boston, and that was it.
Talk a little bit about college and what you learned.
I was, in high school, I had an inkling that I might want to get into broadcasting. I seemed to have an interest in broadcasting. Initially thought maybe sportscasting would be my career. And in high school, I had an excellent English teacher, Mr. Aldridge. And I talked to him about my ideas or my dreams. And he had suggested to me to apply to Emerson College in Boston. I had applied to a few other schools as well, but he had gone to Boston University and knew that Emerson had an outstanding reputation for broadcast journalism and communication. So I took his advice. I applied to Emerson College, was fortunate enough to have gotten a good scholarship for them for 4 years, and went there and studied broadcast journalism and English, where I kind of honed my communication skills, if you will. They had a college radio and TV station, both AM and FM radio and TV, so I had an opportunity in college to work at both radio stations and the television station to get as much experience as I possibly could before I ventured out into the real world to get a real job. So that's how I transitioned from Chicopee into Emerson College in Boston. And it was probably one of the best decisions I ever made, because Emerson did really bring me out of my shell and helped me develop my communication skills, especially for the broadcasting industry.
Your first job out of college, obviously, was with WHYN and WGGB TV. It was in radio, I understand. Talk a little bit about what it was like starting in radio and your first job there.
It was. I was fortunate. I got out of college and applied for a job at WHYN Radio, which was an AM/FM radio station along with a TV station, WHYN TV, so it was all 3 in 1. And I remember going in for my job interview. Durham Caldwell was the news director at the time, and I was a little bit intimidated, a little bit nervous, going in. And HYN at the time was the leader in the market. It was top 40, it was #1. It had, the best radio personalities and disc jockeys like Phil D on the radio. It had an award-winning news department led by Durham Caldwell, had reporters like John Deegan, Dave Scott, Ron Russell. So I kind of felt a little bit intimidated as a kid fresh out of college trying to get a job at this award-winning radio station. So I took my interview, and Durham tells the funny story that I never left him my contact information. So I don't know whether or not I was too nervous and thought I didn't get the job, or he kind of was underwhelmed by my performance and decided not to call me back. But anyway, we laugh about it today, but a couple of days later we did hook up. He offered me the job, and of course I was thrilled. And I started April 15th, 1968, my first job on radio, doing morning drive, backing up the great Ron Russell. And eventually, from radio, I was able seamlessly to transition into television because it was the same operation. It was AM, FM radio, and TV. So in a way, it worked out for me because I did get into TV, and it was, as they say, a seamless transition because of the same ownership.
What was it like back then? Could you paint a picture, just a little bit of?
I sure can. I think I can remember that far back, 50 years. But it was so much different than it is today in terms of the technology in the business. We started writing our news stories in that radio newsroom with typewriters and carbon paper. Put that paper in, type out our stories with carbon paper. We shot our video for our TV stories in 16 millimeter film with Bolex cameras. So you'd have to go out, and if you were filming a story, you'd have to shoot the story, and then you'd have to come back to the station, process the film, through a chemical process. Once the film was processed, you'd take it and you'd edit it, you'd splice it up and glue the different pieces of film together onto a reel to make one story. So it was very physically demanding as well for the editors to be able to glue the pieces together. So we shot our video on 16 millimeter film. Then, of course, over the years, you went from film to videotape, digital technology, high definition now, iPhones, social media. So the transition has been like from A to Z in terms of the technology.
Talk about your first big story that you did.
I was fortunate. My first big story, and again, Durham asked me to cover this story, was just a couple of years after I started there. It was back in 1973, and I'll never forget it. It was the return of the POWs to Westover Air Reserve Base. Now, these were prisoners of war who were primarily from Westover, so many of them were from Western Massachusetts, who had been captured after their planes were shot down over North Vietnam, captured, held in captivity there, many of them tortured. So it was quite a homecoming when they came back to Westover. In any event, that 1973 event, I can remember on the tarmac, it was nighttime, and that huge plane flew into Westover, landed, taxied to where we were standing on the tarmac with hundreds and hundreds of family members. There was a band playing, there were family members waiting to greet their loved ones, and as soon as they started getting off the plane, one by one they walked down the steps. Their family members rushed from where they were standing to greet their loved ones with hugs, with kisses, with tears of joy. So it was a tremendously emotional story, probably the most emotional story I've covered. And I learned then that how important television could be in terms of telling a story that had that much emotion and drama. That's what television can do well. And I used that video to its max. I kept narrating the story, but I let the video tell the story because there was so much natural sound, so much emotion at that particular time. So that story really spoke for itself in terms of the emotion and what television can bring to people in terms of a story like that. And it also taught me to appreciate the sacrifice of our veterans. Veterans have sacrificed for the freedoms we enjoy as Americans, including the all-important freedom of the press, which I'm grateful for each and every day of my career. So I was thankful for the veterans for their sacrifice, but so happy to see these veterans come home into the waiting arms of their loved ones on the tarmac at Westover. Just emotional as you can get.
Now, you touched on this a little bit before, but what are some of the differences between when you started, how long the newscast was, the news gathering process, to what it's like?
Yeah. Back then, we had a couple of newscasts a day. I think we had like a 6 o'clock newscast and maybe an 11 o'clock newscast, half hour. So there wasn't a lot of news time in terms of filling up the day. Over the years, as the technology advanced and as television came into its own, the expansion of local news occurred. And by that I mean more local news per day, more news shows, more content gathering, and So for example, today we have a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week, 365-day news operation. We start at 5 a.m. in the morning. We have a news from 5 to 7 a.m. and then from 7 to 9 on Fox 6. So it's a 4-hour news block that goes from 5 to 9. At noontime, we have an hour of news. A hard news segment from 12 to 12:30, then sort of a featurist interview section from 12:30 to 1. And then we start right back again at 4 in the afternoon on CBS 3. We have an hour's worth of news, and then from 5 to 6:30, we have an hour and a half of news. 5 to 6 we have on ABC 40, and then 6 to 6:30 is ABC 40 and CBS 3 Springfield. Then we go to 10 o'clock at night. We have a half hour on Fox 6 from 10 to 10:30, and 11 o'clock, 11 to 11:30, we have a half hour news on ABC 40 and CBS 3. And then the cycle continues. So we're off the air at 11:30 at night, but at 5 in the morning, we're back on the air. So you can see the newsroom is staffed 24/7 to get all this news and information to the people.
You mentioned your first big story, but you've covered a lot of stories over the years. Which ones stand out? What are some of the biggest ones and the ones that were most important to you?
Yeah, I mentioned the POW story because that was my first big story I covered, and it had such emotion, which I had never seen in a story before. So that impacted me quite a bit. Then I've had the opportunity to do some traveling in my business as well. Been to the Holy Land, for example, where we put together a documentary and a 10-part news series. Also had an opportunity to go to Rome to cover the beatification of Pope John Paul. When Pope Francis came to Philadelphia, there were 1 million people there, pilgrims greeting Pope Francis. Had an opportunity to cover that story. And then there were a number of missions of mercy. We went on with Westover and the air crew at Westover. Among them, you know, flying supplies into New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. Was over in Ramstein Air Force Base in Germany, covering a local medical unit out of Westover who were taking care of the wounded soldiers and Marines coming back from the battlefields in Iraq. They were being treated there, stabilized before they were they come back to the United States for further treatment. So the job has taken me all over the place, and some exciting moments too. I mean, for example, saw the excitement of a space shuttle launch down at Cape Kennedy, and then one of the all-time favorites, and this was sitting in the cockpit of an F-16 fighter jet with a jet fighter pilot taking off and doing 9 Gs up in the air. I wasn't right for 2 days after that. It took a little toll on me physically, but it was tremendously exciting. And then, of course, you know, there are the local stories, and there's a million local stories as well. I've covered some big trials in the course of my career. Among them, one that lasted almost 5 months. This was the Kristen Gilbert trial. This was the VA nurse up in Leeds who was accused and convicted of murdering 4 veterans and injuring some others. She was convicted of those 4 deaths, and it was an interesting case because it lasted 5 months. There were 2 phases of it, the guilt or innocence phase and then the penalty phase. After she was convicted, there was a whole mini trial as to whether or not she would be put to death. And since the crimes occurred on federal property, that is the VA in Leeds, the federal government had recommended the death penalty for her, even though Massachusetts has banned the death penalty. So we went through that phase of the trial as well, 2-facet trial. So that was an interesting trial. There have been others. Remember the trial of Alfred Gaynor, the convicted serial killer in Springfield, and how that instilled fear in the people until he was arrested and convicted. So there were a number of local, national, international stories that I had the pleasure of covering as well. And my goodness, I could go on for a long time on this, but I should mention too, I was our political reporter, so I covered like 8 presidential visits to Western Massachusetts and Massachusetts. Also, had an opportunity to cover political conventions dating back to 1984 when Walter Mondale ran with Geraldine Ferraro on the Democratic ticket, and Geraldine Ferraro at the time was the first female to be nominated on a national ticket. She was the vice presidential candidate. Walter Mondale was the presidential candidate, and that convention was at the Moscone Center in San Francisco. So my job has taken me all kinds of different directions in different areas.
There's a lot of heartbreaking stories going back to Holly Perrine and disappearance, Lizzie, that law that was signed in West Springfield by the governor. How did you deal with that and the families?
Yeah, very, very difficult, because you did see tragedy firsthand. You saw what those kind of stories do to families, how they tear them apart. And these stories, you know, have no happy ending. You know, people are convicted of heinous crimes. Their families obviously are going through a lot of pain, not to mention, of course, most importantly, the families of the victims who are going through you know, terrible pain themselves. So it's difficult. You try to put yourself in the position of being a reporter where you cover the facts, but you know, as reporters, we are people as well. We're human beings as well, so we feel emotion to cover these stories, and you feel for the people, you feel for the victims, and you just try to do the best you can in terms of doing the story objectively, presenting it objectively without sensationalizing it too much, but you never ever know what's going to happen in that courtroom. I remember a number of years ago we were covering a pretrial motion for the Alfred Gaynor case. This was the individual I just spoke about who was convicted of serial killings in Springfield. He was in court, and some family members of one of the victims were in court and got so upset they literally charged Alfred Gaynor where he was sitting next to his lawyer and attacked him. One person grabbed a chair and swung it over his head and hit Gaynor, and there was mayhem and pandemonium in the courtroom as they whisked Gaynor away. But this is the kind of crime that can trigger this kind of emotion at a moment's notice. So you involve yourself with all kinds of emotions sometimes in the courtroom, especially for these tragic cases. But it's difficult, but you try to be as objective as you possibly can. But you know, you still feel obviously a lot of emotion for the story.
Tell us about your family and how you were able to balance career and family.
Oh boy, that is so, I've been so blessed. I really have. I've got 3 children, all grown up now, all working, doing well for themselves. I've got 6 grandchildren and a wonderful wife. And I'll tell you a quick story about Maureen. Without her, I wouldn't have been able to make it this far in the business, that is for sure. I had mentioned I started on radio in 1968, a year after I started on radio. 1969, I met Maureen, and it was by pure chance. I was completing a radio shift. I had gone out to the reception area to chit-chat with our receptionist, who happened to be Maureen's sister. Maureen happened to walk in while I was chit-chatting with Margaret, and we kind of looked at each other. I thought to myself, I think I'd like to ask her if she'd maybe want to go out. You know, we kind of hit it off. Margaret set us up on a date. We went out. First date went okay. It was a typical date, you know, movies, drinks, and so forth. I was interested in a second date, and Maureen apparently told Margaret that I was okay, but you know, she wasn't doing cartwheels. I was maybe a little bit boring. Margaret went to bat for me, thank goodness. And one thing led to another. We went on a second date. It was a nice picnic at the Quabbin Reservoir. We were a lot more relaxed. We got to know each other better. Things clicked after that. One thing led to another. I met Maureen in April of '68. We were engaged that fall, '69 I should say, engaged in that fall, and were married in February of 1970. So all within a year's period of time. I met Maureen, got engaged, and were married. All that happening in 1969, my second year on the job at the radio station. But she's been wonderful. I mean, because in television and in radio, you work crazy hours. You work weekends, you work nights, you work early mornings, you work holidays. So it takes a special person you're married to who can keep the family together, raise the children. Many of those nights that I was away from home, Maureen was, you know, putting the kids to bed, giving them supper and so forth. So without her, I certainly wouldn't have been able to achieve what I have achieved, and I'm grateful to this day. And you know, I sit here today, 50 years in the television business, but 48 years married to Maureen. And I'm certainly very, very proud of my family. I have a son in Rochester, New York. He's at McQuaid Academy there. He teaches English. He's a development director and loves his job. I have a daughter who's in Columbia, Maryland, who's a physical therapist. She works in a burn unit. That's her specialty, PT. My daughter Maura is down in Richmond, Virginia. She's a special ed teacher by trade and currently is doing some work as a pharmacy technician. So they're all doing well. 6 grandchildren, and they range in age from about 6 months to 19 years. So the family, knock on wood, is doing well, and so are the kids. And I'm extremely, extremely proud of them.
What advice do you have for students who are starting out today that want to get into journalism?
Good question. I would say, number one, to be successful in journalism today, you have to have a passion for what you want to do. It's not a 9-to-5 job. It's not a job where you can come in, mail it in, and go home. It's an all-consuming job. And as I said, you have to have a passion for what you do, because the young reporters today, whether it's print journalism, broadcast journalism, have so much to do. I was fortunate in that as a reporter, when I would cover a story, I'd go out with the photographer. So we would be a team. I, the reporter, would do the interviews, write the story. The photographer would do the videotape, edit the story, and put it on the air. So we were a team. Today, a lot of the young reporters getting into broadcast journalism are what we call MMJs. They are multimedia journalists. That is, they grab a camera, they go out, they shoot their story, they have to edit their story, write that story, and in some cases, they actually have to go out and do a live shot all by themselves. So that's a big responsibility. It's physically demanding, it's professionally demanding as well. So these kids coming out of college are trained to do that, to edit and everything like that. But it's a lot more pressure on them, as you can well imagine. So I would tell the kids, I think it's a noble occupation. I really do. Reporting has been the love of my life. It's a passion I've had for since I started 50 years ago. I wouldn't be doing anything else. But you've got to really want it. You've got to have a passion for it, be willing to work hard. And when you first start, you don't make a lot of money. You don't get rich quick. So but the rewards of the job are incredible. You know, you get a chance to cover news stories, to meet people, cover different events, and inform the public, which is so important today, to try to present stories that are fair and objective. So it's a rewarding career, but certainly one which you've got to have that passion for to be successful.
Well, Ray, we really appreciate you coming in today, and we could go a lot longer talking, but tell us a little bit about your plans going forward.
I'm going to, my wife and I are staying in the area. As I told you, she's from Western Massachusetts, I am too. I'm going to sit back, kind of smell the roses for a little while, see what happens. We do some volunteer work, which I'm sure I will be continuing. I will be around, and who knows if I get a call or two, you know, for election nights or something like that. You may see me back on the air doing stories of that nature. But we're going to be in this area. Our children, you know, live outside the area, so we'll be doing some traveling and seeing them. Maureen and I have a bucket list to do, and she's got a to-do list. But since I'm not the most handy guy in the world, we'll probably gravitate more toward the bucket list and enjoy ourselves. But we will keep ourselves busy, certainly, and I think just be able to have that flexibility and freedom of doing what you want to do when you want to do it. Because most of the people I know, my relatives, my friends, retired years ago. So you know, they're in the retirement mode myself. But even though I may be, you know, retiring, getting away from the daily grind of the business, I think that reporter will always stay with me in my heart. You know, you're always a reporter. You'll always be looking for a story or trying to find an angle and so forth. But it won't be on a daily, you know, Monday through Friday basis now. So we're going to enjoy ourselves. We're going to relax, and as they say, enjoy life and see where it takes us.
Well, congratulations, Ray, and we wish you the best.
Thank you very much, Mike. I appreciate the time. Nice chatting with you.